Gracias, amigos y amigas. Qué alegría que estemos todos juntos aquí en la Iglesia de Todos los Santos. Dear friends, what a joy it is for us all to be together here this morning here at All Saints Church. Mi nombre es Mike Kinman. My name is Mike Kinman, soy Rector. I am the Rector. Mi pronombres son él. My pronouns are he, him, and his. It is phenomenal to have you here. We're all looking forward to the day that we can be in person together. And we're just deeply grateful that we can be together in this way, and especially for those of you who are coming to us from places other than Pasadena and Southern California. We're drawing folks from all over the country and even all around the world. And I want to assure you that even as we come back together physically in this space, we're going to continue to do this. You are part of the All Saints community, and we're going to continue to loop you in and give you a chance to engage this community and offer your gifts and be nourished by the love that we share together. Speaking of the love we share together, something that has never stopped happening on this campus is our Sunday morning food program, also with our Monday morning food program. This Sunday, Erica, Jan, Corey, and Bob were out here and gave away 55 sack lunches and about 80 clothing items and about 100 masks. So that's wonderful work that they did, and thank you so much. We also had a church had to cancel their Red Cross blood drive for this morning, and so the Red Cross was in need of an additional space. So we opened up Sweetland Hall, and so we have a blood drive happening here on campus this morning. Thank you so much to Blas Tapia of our building and ground staff who came here early this morning to let the Red Cross folks in, help them get set up. And so if you go to the Red Cross blood.org site and click in the upper right-hand corner ASCC, I think you can still make an appointment for today. They'll be here until I believe about 4 o'clock, and come down to All Saints Church and make a donation of blood. We are in a critical place in terms of need for blood donations, and we'll have Huntington Hospital will be here later in the month having a blood drive, and then we'll have the Red Cross back again, I believe, in June. So this is something that we're just going to keep on doing as long as the need exists in the community. Every week we have a partner in love. This is something we started when the pandemic started, highlighting an area organization that does some of the same work that our values value. And this week, our partner in love is the Nature Conservancy, and we're going to be hearing a lot about them this morning. The Nature Conservancy is a global environmental nonprofit working to create a world where people and nature can thrive. It is one of the most effective and wide-reaching environmental organizations in the world. It impacts conservation in 72 countries and territories. You can just go to support.nature.org. That's it, support.nature.org. Make a gift to support the work of the Nature Conservancy. And that is a great tie-in segue to our guest this morning. We have talked for a long time about the effects of climate change here at All Saints Church. It has been a focus of ours. We've had and continue to have a climate change task force, and we're looking at what difference we can make. And what we wanted to do today is really focus on what are some of the things that are working. What is some of the work that is happening, particularly in our area, that is really helping with climate change, both preventing it and also helping with the effects of it. And so we're thrilled to have with us today Alyssa Mann. She is the Coastal Project Director of the Nature Conservancy. She's based here in LA, actually lives here in Pasadena, and she focuses on developing and implementing nature-based strategies and policy solutions to ensure a more resilient California. She manages TNC's climate adaptation demonstration projects, including, and I think we're going to hear about some of these, restoring and revitalizing Ormond Beach and Oxnard, nature-based adaptation of Highway 1 at Elkhorn Slough, I think. Okay, she's nodding, I got it right, in Monterey County, and developing resilient strategies for the Point Mugu Naval Base and surrounding wetlands. She's got a background in coastal planning, emergency management, and international affairs. And before joining the Nature Conservancy, she worked at the NOAA grant program at USC and a whole bunch of federal and state government agencies, including FEMA, the US Department of State, and the state of California. I'm going to turn over to her in just a second because she's got just some amazing stuff to share with us. A reminder that you can, if you are with us on Zoom, you can put your questions in either the chat or the Q&A. If you're with us on Facebook, on our Facebook page, put your questions in the comment section there. And then you can also text your questions. We use the same text number that we use for the prayers during the service. And that's 910-TEXT-ASC. 910-TEXT-ASC, which numerically is 910-839-8272. 910-839-8272. And with that, Alyssa, welcome to All Saints Church. Thanks so much for spending this hour with us, and would love to just learn about this incredible work that you're doing.
Thanks so much, Mike. Here, let me get my presentation up here. And hopefully you can see it.
Yep, we got it.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. First, I'd like to express my thanks to Mike and to Bill Devereaux for inviting me to speak with all of you today. And for all of you joining today, I'm honored to be here. Again, my name is Alyssa Mann. I work for the Nature Conservancy here in California. I'll tell you a little bit about myself and the organization I work for in a minute. But I'm calling in today from where I live, likely not far from all of you, here in Pasadena. And I would like to acknowledge that I am on traditional, ancestral, and unceded land of the Tongva and Tatavian people who were the stewards and caretakers of the LA Basin. And to acknowledge, especially working for an organization that owns and manages land for conservation, that has come at a dire cost to Indigenous people, and to express my commitment to supporting the original and current stewards of our natural systems in any way that I can.
Amen.
Let's see if I can get my slides to, there we go. So I'm here to talk to you a little bit about the big challenge in front of all of us, climate change. My work is focused on how nature and nature-based solutions to the climate crisis can help enhance the resilience of our communities, our economies, and ecosystems. The Nature Conservancy is the largest conservation organization in the world, with teams across the US and in over 70 countries. And we are focused on using science to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends. There is perhaps nothing more global than the need to prevent the worst impacts of climate change and be resilient to natural disasters. And the Nature Conservancy is uniquely positioned to have impact both locally and across the globe. For instance, almost the minute the California fire season ends, it begins again in Australia, impacting both nature and communities. My work focuses here in California, but I've bounced around a bit during my career. I'm not a scientist, but I work to bridge the work of our scientists to deliver on-the-ground conservation projects and influence policy and decision-making for bigger impact. I work across a spectrum of climate-driven hazards, including wildfires, floods, and sea level rise. My work is focused on the need to reimagine where and how we build and even rebuild our communities in the face of climate change, and how nature should be central in that strategy. My deepest expertise is on coastal resilience, so how sea level rise fueled by climate change will significantly alter the California coastline as we know it, and what we can do to address these challenges. So you'll hear a lot about that in my talk today. So I'm told that I sometimes give depressing talks, but I promise, stay with me. These first set of slides are the most doom and gloom I'll get, but I promise I'm going to present you with hope and optimism that we can ensure a better future for younger and future generations. But I won't sugarcoat it either. This is a big task in front of all of us, and it's going to take a lot of collective action, political will, and sacrifice to achieve. I will say these first 100+ days of 2021 have given me a lot of hope, which is saying a lot since we are all still separated. I'm still at home juggling kids' Zoom school, working from home, and worrying about safety. A little bit about me. I was born and raised up in Santa Barbara, a place that's no stranger to big disasters, squeezed between growing sea level rise challenges and what feels like a constant cycle of major wildfires and mudslides. My family has evacuated multiple times for major fires, but luckily came out okay. Not everyone was so lucky. The losses from the Painted Cave fire from 1990 is one that stuck with me for a long time and likely influenced my career path, along with a big passion for nature, especially our oceans and coasts. I started my professional career in government, planning for natural disasters, both at the state level and for the federal government. I was a planner, but I would constantly get tapped for emergency response, major fires, hurricanes, tornadoes, and they just kept coming. I also worked with international partners around the globe to better understand lessons from their disasters that would help us here in the United States. It was these years working for FEMA and the US State Department that cemented for me a growing concern about climate change, that this constant disaster cycle would continue to grow exponentially if we stayed on our current trajectory. And this is what brought me to conservation and to the Nature Conservancy, and that restoring nature was a missing ingredient. We know that climate change is threatening our safety. Some of the most profound impacts of climate change on our communities come by the way of disasters. And even though sometimes it doesn't feel like it in these polarizing times, belief in and acceptance of human-caused climate change is actually on the rise, and largely because people are already seeing impacts. People understand that releasing greenhouse gases into our atmosphere is like an addiction that is poisoning the body. And that addiction is to fossil fuels. Mm-hmm. Our fire season is now 75 days longer on average, and experts project that it will lengthen even further. Climate experts also tell us that flooding will become more intense and frequent with climate change, with the 100-year flood becoming 100 times more likely by 2050 in some areas of California. Also, research is telling us that by 2050, more than 600,000 people will be at risk from coastal flooding due to sea level rise here in California. So think about it. These effects are expected within the lifetime of a 30-year mortgage now. So this is not the distant future. Research is showing us that climate change impacts are often disproportionately distributed across populations. Some populations, particularly those that experience social inequities, are less able to prepare, respond to, and recover from extreme events. While climate change will affect all of us, it will affect the most vulnerable the most, particularly low-income, predominantly communities of color, from issues around food security, access to clean water, and adverse health outcomes. And they are less responsible for the problem. This underscores the enormous global inequality that exists, where 20 of the 36 highest emitting countries are among the least vulnerable to negative impacts of future climate change. I was actually listening to an event just this past week hosted by UCLA, and the speaker, Rector from Jobs to Move America, said, if we want the environmental movement to succeed, we need justice to succeed. And I think this absolutely extends to climate change. Our strategies need to center on those most harmed, which means centering justice and equity and ensuring a just transition. In addition to the impacts to people, climate change also threatens nature. In 2018, we teamed up with the state of California on a comprehensive statewide study to map the state's coastal habitats, evaluate their vulnerability to sea level rise, and identify strategies to mitigate potential loss. This is the bad news. With 5 feet of sea level rise, the coast of tomorrow will not look like today's coast. There's quite a bit of vulnerability up and down the coast. With 5 feet of sea level rise, nearly 60% of California's coastal habitats are highly vulnerable. And this has cascading impacts. 39 rare, threatened, and endangered species are highly vulnerable, some of which are only found here on the coast. And 41,000 acres of already conserved land are projected to be drowned by subtidal waters. This means the very investments in conservation that we have collectively made over the years are under threat. And this is just the coast. I could have pointed to the impact to our forests, freshwater systems, the oceans themselves, you name it, all are impacted. So what can we do? First, and I can't say this enough, We need to get off of our addiction to fossil fuels, and soon. Here at the Nature Conservancy, we talk a lot about that this is the determining decade. We need to make big progress this decade. We already know that some of this warming is already baked into the system, and we've already seen 1 degree Celsius of warming. But avoiding the worst potential of climate change has to be the top priority. That means a rapid and just transition to a renewable energy-based economy. The shift will require vast investment in new infrastructure, such as renewable energy power plants, electric transmission lines, and batteries, requiring about 1 to 3 million acres of land to support the state's 100% zero carbon energy target. There's actually another really great team at the Nature Conservancy that I invite you to check out, focused on showing pathways to deliver that bold goal, while also protecting important landscapes and wildlife habitats. And that initiative is called the Power of Place. But next, how do we adapt to the changes we already see and will continue to see? It would be crazy to not think about the implications of this for the shape of our communities. Incidentally, there are relatively few things that are so profound that they force a reckoning with our historic patterns of behavior and development. And we are experiencing at least 3 of them right now. COVID, which is dramatically reshaping how and where we work and how we live. Racial and social justice, which is, in my opinion, finally getting the attention it merits. Mm-hmm. And climate-driven disasters, which we either reckon with before they happen, or we will need to reckon with the results in the aftermath. So as I mentioned before, when we first started, I promised I'd switch to hope and optimism. My work focuses on how nature is a critical solution for both people and nature. We call these nature-based solutions or natural infrastructure. What does that mean? I can give you, a jargony definition, or I can just say this. Nature provides intrinsic resilience. And if we can restore or even mimic those natural processes, people and nature will benefit. Mike and I actually had a really great conversation about this before the talk today. So to go back to that health metaphor, restoring nature's resilience properties is like boosting our immune system. There are a lot of great examples here. And to be honest, I can't speak to all of them, but I will zero in a bit on the power of wetlands. Coastal wetlands help reduce emissions because of their high carbon sequestration rates, meaning they capture and hold carbon. You also may have heard this called a sink. Coastal wetlands accumulate carbon at a rate somewhere between 30 to 50 times higher than in forest ecosystems. However, their area is much smaller. So here in California, we've lost over 90% of our historic coastal wetlands. In addition to storing carbon, coastal wetlands also provide flood protection from coastal storms and sea level rise by absorbing floodwaters, dissipating wave action, and serving as a buffer between the ocean and communities. After Hurricane Sandy, TNC researchers determined that the wetlands in the northeastern US reduced overall flood damages by $625 million, which is about 10% on average throughout the entire region of impact. We know that wetlands in California do the same, and we are working to restore wetlands with partners and even working with insurance companies to invest. So this beneficial link between nature and people has been well documented. Healthy ecosystems provide a myriad of benefits to people and human well-being, social, economic, and ecological. And that need for nature came to a laser focus during the pandemic. So how do we get nature to deliver these multiple benefits? Our approach here at the Nature Conservancy is first develop cutting-edge science to support this goal, both at the landscape scale and for this next category, which is our on-the-ground demonstrations. So we're continually asking ourselves, what are the critical geographies where we must advance nature-based solutions for resilience? Who are the big stakeholders to engage for large-scale impact? And how do we work with, empower, and support partners to do that? And finally, how do we take these lessons from our demonstrations to scale? While we are a large global organization, we still know we can't get there alone. We must empower our partners across the state and across the world. That also means working with our local, state, and federal agencies to advance administrative action to make the needed changes at that level. We pursue legislation for the extra push to action and to ensure funding is available to achieve these solutions at scale. And looking to where the private sector, like the insurance industry, can make gains in innovative financing and tools to support resilience. So I want to tell you about a couple places where I work that make me hopeful for the future. First is Ormond Beach and Point Mugu in Ventura County, just about 70 miles northwest of us here in Pasadena. If we were in a room together instead of virtual, I'd ask all of you if you've ever heard of or been to the Ormond Beach wetlands. And if my suspicions hold true with this crowd, it would be a small group or possibly no one. Likely you know of Point Mugu, but not Ormond Beach. Ormond Beach is a 650-acre wetlands complex just north of the Navy base at Point Mugu in Oxnard, California. South Oxnard, the community closest to the wetlands, is a farm-working community, low-income, majority non-English speaking, and also home to a pretty big indigenous community from Mexico, Mixtec and Zapotec. This community has had to endure decades of environmental injustice due to industrial development and pollution on its coastline, which has degraded and impacted these wetlands. On one side of the complex, there's a toxic Superfund site, remnants of a now defunct metal recycling plant. And in the middle, a natural gas power plant that is soon to be decommissioned, thanks to the activism and determination of the community and partner organizations. Despite all of this, it really is an incredible jewel of Southern California. Most coastal wetlands have been drained and filled or are bisected by major transportation infrastructure like the Pacific Coast Highway. Ormond still has an intact beach, dune, wetland, and upland transition zone, and is critically important for wildlife, including threatened and endangered species that call it home, like the western snowy plover, the California leaf tern, the tidewater goby, and more. With the community, the Nature Conservancy, along with the state of California and the city of Oxnard, invested in protecting Ormond Beach and is working to realize a community vision to restore the wetlands for habitat and community resilience, as well as improve public access and enjoyment for the communities, especially South Oxnard, who have not had access to the coast, had enough access to the coast and nature. The state and the federal government have just invested $2 million in this work so we can complete planning and begin restoration. It's really an exciting time. And we're also working with the US Navy just next door to make the base and the over 1,000 acres of wetlands they protect to make them more resilient to sea level rise, which would mean together with Ormond Beach, it would comprise the largest wetland system in Southern California, spanning 9 miles from Port Hueneme to Point Mugu. So the next one, this is Elkhorn Slough up in Monterey County. If you haven't visited this amazing place, it needs to be on your list. It's the 7th largest estuary in California and the largest extent of salt marsh in the state outside of the Bay Area. The slough supports a wide array of species, but perhaps most famously, it's transcendently adorable that threatened southern sea otter. TNC was the first organization to protect Elkhorn Slough in the 1970s and helped establish the Elkhorn Slough Foundation and Reserve that now manage these lands. The slough is at risk to sea level rise. 85% of the marsh is projected to be drowned by ocean waters with 5 feet of sea level rise. Not only are the habitats at risk, but also the community of Moss Landing and its critical infrastructure, including the Pacific Coast Highway, or what they call Highway 1, that you can see in this picture on the left. In collaboration with Caltrans, the state's transportation agency, regional transportation agencies, economists from academia, and natural resource managers, we're using rigorous science to develop nature-based approaches to adapt the highway that would provide benefits to the transportation infrastructure itself and the critical habitats of Elkhorn Slough. And finally, how important it is to get decision makers and communities to imagine a different way, nature and natural infrastructure instead of seawalls and gray infrastructure. We are testing the use of virtual reality and visualization products to help communicate with stakeholders, legislators, the community, but also help us to better understand the potential application of these tools in communicating with the public on climate change and adaptation more broadly, and moving the needle of support for bold action. You can actually go check these VR experiences out on our website. And even if you don't have Oculus goggles, there are smartphone applications and a web-based application, so you can see them. So disasters are awful, but they also create opportunities to make communities safer, greener, and more equitable. There is a big opportunity in front of us as we look towards recovering from the calamity we are hopefully currently coming out of. The US and California have set an ambitious goal of protecting 30% of lands and waters by 2030 to protect biodiversity and address climate change. The Biden administration is also looking to invest a lot in our nation's infrastructure. And that can also mean investing in natural infrastructure and the types of nature-based solutions I talked about today. The California legislature is also considering sending a climate resilience bond to voters for the 2022 ballot to implement nature-based solutions. I invite you to speak to your Congress and state representatives to say these things are things you care about. It will take all of us to turn this ship around, and lots of this will come as a no-brainer to you. But if you are wondering what you can do, certainly look at your own footprint and life to see what contributions you can make. Also think about how you're investing your money. Are you helping prop up companies that are causing harm? I invite you to check out socially responsible investing, a field that's taking off. It doesn't mean you have to sacrifice returns or financial stability. But in general, I'm always challenging myself and my family to see what we can do, recognizing that we can't do it all or afford it all. But also how important it is to have your voice heard and pushing leaders for change, whether that's at the local level here in Pasadena or contacting state and congressional representatives to say you support investment in conservation. That actually goes a long way. And certainly choosing leaders that share these concerns. I know personally, I look to organizations like the LA League of Conservation Voters to help me choose who I support. And supporting organizations where you can. TNC is a great organization to support, but there are also lots of other conservation and advocacy organizations, even ones right here, conserving the San Gabriel Mountains. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much. While you are thinking and putting in questions in the chat, I'm going to try to pull up a quick video. Hopefully this works. We put this together about 2 years ago when we launched a campaign called Hope for the Coast, where we asked state and local leaders to make specific commitments to protect our coast, that it was possible to achieve no net loss of coastal habitats even in the face of sea level rise if we were all working collectively. I still find it inspiring, so I wanted to share. So hang on while I switch screens here. Stop this share. And then, okay. Oh, share sound.
Yep.
All right, here we go. And I'm going to mute so we can hopefully hear it.
Thank you so much, Alyssa. I'm trying to figure out where to start. There's so much there. First thing, and please, I just want to also remind people, you can get your questions in. You can text them to 910-TEXT-ASC, 910-TEXT-ASC, which is also 910-839-8272. 910-839-8272. If you're with us on Zoom, you can put them in the chat or the Q&A. And if you're on our Facebook page, you can just put them in the comments section. And so what I'm interested in, first of all, is of all the stuff that you're working on, what excites you the most? What gets you sort of most juiced about working on and kind of gets you out of bed in the morning?
That's a really good question. You know, I think what's really exciting is that we're, I think, at a really interesting time right now where people are really starting to see sort of all the interconnections between our own lives and the place that we live. And so, you know, I'm really excited to figure out if we can make some of these, you know, more innovative ideas a reality. And also, you know, I especially during COVID have, you know, found a lot of joy and time in nature as very healing. And I think if we can create more ways to have people access these kinds of spaces and have them work for us, I think that's where a lot of my excitement is.
Yeah, I was thinking as we're watching that video, and just the pictures is just beautiful. In fact, on Friday, you know, my wife and I just went out to the beach for, you know, just for part of the day. And, you know, especially having lived the last 20 years before I came here in the middle of the country, just loving so much being close to our coastlands and what a treasure it is and how just personally like restoring it is. Like one of the things I'm aware of though is like you look at housing prices in these areas that are near where those pictures are, and they are predictably just ridiculously high because everyone wants to live near that beauty. I'm wondering, it would seem that the real estate industry in Southern California, at least, I mean, actually the prices in Northern California are just as high. It would seem the real estate industry would have a vested interest in protecting this land because the value of the real estate is directly related to the beauty of the land. Is there any sort of relationship that's going on there? What is the role of the real estate industry in promoting conservation?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a pretty mixed bag. I think what's difficult here in California is we haven't seen quite the same impacts yet that, say, are happening on the East Coast, right? Some of that is just because sea level rise has been a bit slower here. That will change. I think, you know, again, having people sort of imagine that that these landscapes can really change is hard, right? So I do think that some of the things we're trying to test with visualizations, it might be one way to get at that. I do think, you know, we are seeing impacts to the real estate, into housing prices and the real estate industry in other parts of the country. And, you know, it's a really difficult question too about, you know, this here in California, it's very controversial to talk about moving away from the shore. And ultimately it's the things that houses often do to protect, you know, flooding from happening at their home. They might build this big seawall to do that. And what we found is that when you put that kind of gray infrastructure in place, it actually leads to more beach loss because
I just want to stop.
Scours away. Yeah,
talk about that.
Yeah, so it scours away sand. It actually increases the force of wave action, and actually has a very negative impact. And so, you know, it's a really hard thing to balance. Where you know, this, you know, we're definitely a system based on property rights. But yet California in the 1970s passed the Coastal Act, which was very much about protecting the coastline in perpetuity. And so how do we balance those competing interests. I do think we will end up getting to a point where, we are seeing impacts to the real estate industry and the whole housing prices. We are also going to see impacts to whether or not people can get insurance. We're seeing that in fire prone areas. And so I think once we actually have time here that we could plan smarter than they are right now. The East Coast, they're determining decade was like a decade or two ago. We have time to make better decisions here, and whether or not we have sort of the political will to do that, we'll have to see.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting noticing the difference between the East and the West Coast. My wife and I, with her family, have been sort of doing a 1-week vacation on the Outer Banks in North Carolina for close to 30 years. And we have noticed just the size of the beach just doing this and getting so much smaller. Why is it so different? I mean, it seems so much more rapid on the East Coast than the West Coast. Is it the difference in, I don't know, it's like the size of the ocean is different. Like why is it slower here?
Well, one reason is we don't have major hurricanes. And so that's usually, the big time. So what happens, I think what's hard for people to grasp is that sea level rise seems like this very slow creeping disaster. And if you talk about a foot in the next 10 to 20 years, or even 5 feet by 2100, that those things seem harder to grasp. But ultimately, it's these sort of flashy events that have the biggest impact. And we see it here. I mean, we have El Nino years where the ocean is a foot higher anyways because of hotter ocean off, in the Pacific Ocean, which, as water's warm, they expand. And so you see, during certain years that happening, and then you have bigger storm events. And so we, just like the East Coast that are getting hammered with hurricanes on a pretty regular basis, we have some of that. It's just, the sea level rise hasn't, we talk a lot about it being sort of this hockey stick, right? The graph is we're going to get to this point where things are going to exponentially change. But they're already seeing signs of that on the East Coast, and sea level rise is just the way that the warming is happening, and how it's being distributed. They're seeing more of it a little bit earlier than we are, but then they're getting hit with hurricanes. They also have a pretty big issue about storm surge, which is like when water builds up and pushes. Right. We have a little bit of that, but we also have a really deep shelf off of our coast. And so there's just different dynamics here in California than other places. And really, you could look at other places in the world too.
Well, and is this interesting, because I have noticed that it really is starting to impact whether or not people want to buy oceanfront property on the East Coast in a way that it doesn't appear to be happening on the West Coast. And so what you're saying makes sense. Something I'd never really thought much about, which I love that you were talking about, is carbon storage. And I mean, we've talked about how can we decrease our carbon emissions, but what you're talking about, if I get this right, is restoring nature's ability to sequester carbon. And I know you're not a scientist, but can you explain a little more about how that works?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think, different habitat types store carbon. The carbon cycle is very much part of nature. Obviously, with us releasing a lot more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere and a lot more carbon, we've sort of put that on that process on hyperdrive. But naturally, natural habitats sequester carbon. The ocean does. Our forest systems do. Soils are super important. So a lot of thinking through how we do agriculture so that we don't damage the way that process works in soils. And I find coastal wetlands just super interesting because they have such high carbon sequestration rates, but they accumulate over time, right? And so when we interrupt that cycle, which we do in a lot of different ways, we prevent that process from happening. And so then we end up adding, right? We add to the fact that we are putting, all driving our cars, all using, fossil fuels for all different sectors of our life. when we damage our natural environment, we end up adding even more because then those are released. And that's how the system works. So
much
my
of it's
non-scientist, that's the best.
No, that was great. You explained it in a way that I can understand it. So that was perfect.
Okay.
So much of it seems like just sort of recognizing this is the way the land had been for millennia, for thousands of years. In a very short period of time, we have changed it, and that has affected the ability of the land to adapt to climate change. Is that sort of a decent, simplistic explanation of what's going on?
Absolutely. You see that, obviously, life, and habitats do adapt to changes. Mm-hmm. They just can't adapt this fast. It happens over a long period of time. You look back in the historic record, obviously there's been times when sea level rise was much higher or temperatures were much warmer, but those didn't happen at this kind of a rate.
So it reminds me, because I grew up in Tucson, Arizona in the 70s and 80s. And there was always this sort of rivalry between Tucson and Phoenix. And we were, Tucson was kind of the little sibling and didn't like anything Phoenix. But really part of the big difference I saw growing up between those two cities was that both are in the middle of the desert. And Tucson at least made an attempt to recognize that it was in the middle of the desert and landscape and use water conservation and really embrace its identity as a desert city. And Phoenix didn't. Phoenix sort of flooded its lawns and had lots of golf courses. And what's interesting is the term that kept getting used to describe Phoenix was the Los Angelification of Phoenix, sort of looking at LA. And one of the impacts was the draining of the Colorado River aquifer, which, I remember used to, drive over at Yuma, and it used to be a river, and now it's hardly anything. But like I looked at the picture of Ormond Beach that you said, and there are cactus in that picture. They're prickly pear cactus. How much of this is actually recognizing for us in LA that we live in a coastal community, but also we live in a desert, and having to do this sort of adaptive work of saying, can we return to some of the native vegetation that was once here?
Yeah, I was laughing because if my husband was here, he was a Arizona Wildcat, so he would disagree with that. Bear down. I do think that what's hard is the way that we've dealt with issues, particularly around sort of extreme events, and for example, the way that we have channelized all of our rivers. Right here in Los Angeles, the Los Angeles River is like, there's only like tiny sections of it that are still not channelized and not concretized, and that we did that because this is actually a place that floods a lot, and right. This was their solution back, whenever that really happened, and yet we are seeing sort of the negative ramifications of a lot of those decisions. One, there is still a lot of flooding risk here. Mm-hmm. If we have what they call like the atmospheric rivers, I don't know if you've heard of those talked on Weather Channel.
No.
They tend to get a lot of them up north. Oh gosh, I'm going to do a bad job of explaining it, but it's, it's when we have really high precipitation, and you have like basically what they call a river in the atmosphere, dumping a ton of water here, that we still have that risk, right? And that yet at the same time, we're making decisions to protect ourselves, protect people from flooding, right? In a way that actually is sort of maladaptive in that mm-hmm. It's causing other problems. And a lot of that is destroying the ability of like the natural system to flow. We don't get enough sediment down to have beaches mm-hmm. that can build and create dune systems that then can protect ourselves. So there's just like a lot of poor decisions that we've made, and we continue to do that. You look at fire, right? Mm-hmm. I wish I had the stat in front of me, but there are millions of people that live in this zone called the wild and urban interface, right? Where we're basically living in super high fire risk. Yet we continue to do that. And we, as we're trying to deal with a very real housing crisis that we have in this state, it's easier and cheaper to start building in habitat areas that are at super high risk to fire, and actually end up having all of these negative impacts that, as we bring ourselves and our stuff in those zones, that those make even more fuel. And so then that's part of the reason that we have some of these mega fires. We also have done we've been putting out fires for 100 years, instead of thinking through how do we use fire as part of our ecosystem, and are there, we should be looking to our indigenous and Native American practices of actually using fire to reduce that risk and have those habitats thrive over time. And so it's just, we've just made a lot of bad decisions, and we need to figure out how to reverse course.
So there's like 5 different directions I want to go with this. So this is great. Also, like Laura Solomon just put in the chat, 2 local groups working on this are Arroyos and Foothills Conservancy and the Pasadena Audubon Society. And anyone with a lawn can shrink their lawn and replace it with native plants if they want to support breeding birds. Everyone can do something. I think sometimes we think of like individual things that you can do as sort of an organization or a person, like the kind of stuff Laura's talking about. And part of you is like, well, how much impact will that have? How important is it for us as individual people, for us as a church, to say we're going to look at what Conservancy looks like on just sort of the tiny piece of land that we have authority over?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I said in my talk, there's the things that we can all look at ourselves to do to make a difference. And whether that's making decisions around your own home and property, whether that's looking at your own carbon footprint and where are there places to, where are you able to do things like add solar or have an electric car, think about plastic pollution, all of those kinds of things are contributions that if we all made, that actually makes a huge difference. But at the same time, it's, you can get bogged down and feel like very overwhelmed by all that needs to be done. And ultimately, a lot of the big impacts that can be made is when we're doing it as at bigger scales, right? At community levels, at state levels. And so how important it is to think through how do you support that type of work happening. I think it's a lot of, sometimes feels like the mismatch between electoral cycles and the changes that we need to be made. And so how important it is to have decision makers that are willing to do those really hard first steps so that we can be in a better place down the road that might not necessarily impact their political term, but how important those are for us to make these bigger impacts.
Yeah, it sounds like you're asking for actual leadership. So that would be refreshing and wonderful. So you also talked about, when we were talking about fires, about recognizing the wisdom that came from indigenous peoples in terms of the role of fire in the ecological cycle. And like one of the things we're doing here at All Saints Church is we're starting a couple groups, and we're calling them Tell the Whole Story groups. And one is about the stained glass windows in our church, and another is about the land that we're on, because we aren't the original people who were on this land. And we want to engage with the descendants of people who were on this land before we were, and sort of learn what happened and the impacts of it. One of the, and also say, are there things that we can learn, and is there a way that we can move forward together? What I love is, like, you began with a land acknowledgement, and thanks so much for that. The indigenous peoples I've known and worked with in the various places I've lived have had a really different attitude toward the land than we have. I mean, sort of broad brush statement, they have not seen it as something to be used for their benefit, but really a living organism to be lived in partnership with. And, we care for, it's like what the title of your thing, you care for it and it will care for you. Is the Nature Conservancy partnering with any indigenous peoples in this work? What is that looking like? What are you learning? What can we learn from those among us who are on the land before we were?
Yeah, thanks for that question. We are, but I'll also say that I think we are in a lot of different places, but I also think that we can't, the way that the Nature Conservancy was formed over time, and I wouldn't say that we are necessarily like have it all figured out, and that there's still a lot more that we can do to both uplift voices, have a seat at the table, even seed power in some of these communities is really important. But yeah, I mean, I don't, this is another team at the Nature Conservancy, but we have a team that looks specifically at forest management and what are the different practices in say our sierras that will be important for the long-term resilience to ensure that those ecosystems can survive. And they really look to our Native American partners to help guide that. And I would say there's lots of examples all over the world, actually, where the Nature Conservancy is trying to do this better. But I still think there's a ways to go.
Yeah, so like we just got actually a question about this on the text. It said, what kinds of interfaces between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities are exciting to you and TNC? And what I'm hearing is that there are actually a whole bunch of these happening. And I sort of wonder, how can we strengthen those? Are there ways, and you may have an answer to this question, it may be more of a hypothetical for us, is to say, is there room for local communities, say like All Saints Church, to say, well, we're going to build a relationship and see where the wisdom that emerges from that relationship leads us to act differently.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I actually think that is the most important thing that we need to be doing right now, whether that's you or the Nature Conservancy, is building relationships based on trust and having that open dialogue and open space to not just come with, hey, these are the things that we want to do, but also we're here to listen and hear about the things that matter to Indigenous people. And I think that is absolutely the most important thing to do. We also recognize that we're asking a lot for these tribal governments to be able to work with us and take time in doing that.
Right.
We also are thinking about, like, just like we would pay for expertise from consultants, say, we need to pay for expertise from Native American elders and community members too. And that, we're asking a lot to have them come and tell us and help educate us about what practices, what places are super important for us to be thinking about.
Absolutely. We got some more questions coming in, but I got to get back to the LA River because, I spent the last 20 years before I came here in St. Louis, and, there's the Mississippi, and the river is the river, and the Missouri and the Illinois, and there's rivers everywhere. And it's such a river town. And, I come to LA and they start talking about the LA River. And it's like, oh, I didn't know there was a river running through LA. And then I'm like, it's
where
concreted over. It's like, what is up with that? And I'm starting to learn about what happened with that. But my initial reaction was, what in the world? Why would you pave over a river? And so you said some of that, but I know now it's sort of being revisited from a conservation standpoint. What's the best thing we can do with the LA River?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So the Nature Conservancy was really involved with a passage of Measure W that was really focused on stormwater infrastructure. Obviously we have this need to deal with the fact that we just run all our water out to the ocean and all of the myriad of impacts that has, whether that's to water quality, whether that's to, some of even the potential flooding issues. And so Measure W, I think, is a really big opportunity to be able to not only, get stormwater systems working for us again, but also do it in a way that integrates nature into that. And having, not only do we need to rethink the whole strategy of concretizing rivers for flood risk, but thinking about how do we actually have quality access to rivers and river ecosystems. The LA River tends to pass through really disadvantaged communities that don't have good access to parks or open space. And this is certainly a really big opportunity to be thinking about all of those different benefits as they look to revitalize where there's opportunities along the LA River.
Yeah, and so like that's something I'm really interested in is again, what's best, and then also like, so you said it was Measure W, things that we can do in terms of our own political advocacy to sort of keep in front of us. Sometimes I'll get a question.
Those funds are going to be, they get allocated based on to the different local jurisdictions, and so definitely being vocal about how different jurisdictions are going to spend those funds to do projects and do ones that really embrace some of these multi-benefit solutions.
So sometimes I'll get a question that comes in that I have absolutely no idea what this person is talking about, but it's intriguing to me, and it just is about the limits of my knowledge. So maybe you know something about this. Question for speaker: what is your take on the rising interest in cryptocurrencies and the associated energy requirements to create these virtual coins? I read that the annual energy used to support Bitcoin exceeds that of Argentina. I have no understanding of this. Do you have some idea of what's going on here?
I can't say that I do.
Okay.
I wish my husband was here. My husband's a financial advisor, and his specialty is socially responsible investing. And so maybe I'm going to totally ask him later.
Yeah.
Because I don't know anything about that.
I had no idea that potentially cryptocurrency was contributing to climate change. So I was like, wow, those are two things I never would have put together. So really interesting question. I'm really sorry that we can't really answer to that. Ask that. Here's one that is interesting. Are you seeing the very young people, the kids, taking the lead and teaching their parents and grandparents about sustainability? Is this gaining momentum?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I am so amazed by young people, young activists especially. We work with a really fabulous organization up in Ventura and Santa Barbara County called CAUSE. That's the Central Coast, let me see if I can get the acronym right. Central Coast Alliance United for a Sustainable Economy. And they're an environmental justice organization. And a part of their whole mission, we work a lot with them to help us do meaningful outreach and engagement in Oxnard when I mentioned that other project. And I'm always super inspired by the youth leaders that they help develop and are often the speakers. They do the Nature Conservancy always supports a big event that they do a year. And one of their keynote speakers is always this youth speaker. And it's just amazing. And that example in Ormond Beach with the power plant decommissioning, there was a big push, maybe a little less than a decade ago, to put a new natural gas power plant that's, upgraded with technology and blah, 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 in these places. And I would say those organizations and the youth that came out in numbers and to all kinds of local, city councils and county board of supervisors saying they don't want this in their community anymore, was really the power of that process. I'll also say that one of the other things that I'm really passionate about is how do we get, the places that we protect, like Ormond Beach behind me, how do we get kids and their families out to these places? And how do we have, there's a lot of organizations that are doing amazing work to do environmental literacy and creating curriculum for K through 12 education, and then coupling that with opportunities to get out into nature. And so how important it is. I know for me personally, the fact that I got the opportunities when I was a kid to go to the Channel Islands with school and be able to do some of these things was what solidified in me this passion. And so if we're able to invest in sort of the next generation of conservationists and environmentalists, that how important that is to be thinking about.
That's great. Can you stay on for 5 more minutes, because I got a couple more questions and we're right at 11. Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay, great. So I was fascinated by especially sort of getting people engaged by the virtual reality piece. So is this sort of you can go to a place and strap on the virtual reality goggles and actually sort of look around and see what sea rise will be doing to the place where you're standing?
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
I mean, that's the whole point. So we've done a few of them. So, you know, Oculus, there's also other companies that do it, but they make, so you can do this at your house. You can buy a set of Oculus goggles. I think the Oculus Quest is the new one. And they're not terribly expensive anymore. And then you can go to the Oculus store and buy the application that the Nature Conservancy has created. We've done one for Long Beach, one for Elkhorn Slough. We've even done, there's a project I didn't talk about today up in Paradise, you know, that got really impacted by the campfire a couple of years ago. And you can put on these goggles and be sort of transported to these places and see what sea level rise impacts will look like. And then the other part, you know, we found is how important it is to talk about solutions in a way that they can visualize like what these places could look like if we did the things that we're talking about. And so it's both, right? You don't want to just have the doom and gloom that this is, you know, such a difficult problem. You also want to show how there's some ways forward. And so both, there's 3 of those right now. There's other ones, you know, we work with this really awesome tech firm based in Santa Cruz called Virtual Planet. And they're doing this in a lot of other communities too. There's one in, I think, Santa Cruz. They're going to do one in Santa Barbara. And so they're really, really neat ways to start engaging and thinking about some of these issues.
That sounds great.
But you can also, if you don't have Oculus, you know, we make phone applications too, so you can just like look on your phone and see the same thing. It's not as cool because you're not like in it, but you still get to see a lot of the messages that way.
Right. So before I have the last question to sort of wrap up, I was just reminded that our own Bill Deverell, who we know because he's the one who connected us with you, actually has a book called Whitewashed Adobe, The Rise of Los Angeles and the Remaking of Its Mexican Past that deals with what happened with the Los Angeles River. So we have an expert right in our midst in Bill about this. And so actually Bill's going to be in the forum next week with some of his cohorts from the Civic Memory Working Group, talking about that project from Mayor Garcetti to look at our history as we're in a process of how do we tell the whole story about our history. LA is in a process of that too, and we're going to hear from Bill and some other members of the Civic Memory Working Group then. But Alyssa, as we sort of wrap up in the next 2 minutes, can you kind of give us, first of all, what's the low-hanging fruit? What's the stuff that we can work on now? It's working, we can support it, we can start doing it. And then also, and it may be the same thing, what's the highest leverage point? What's the thing that we can put resources into that's going to have the greatest impact?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned this in my presentation. State of California is going to consider a climate resilience bond in 2022 to put it to voters. And the Nature Conservancy is one of the sort of organizations pushing that. And so certainly like how critical it is to get investment towards these types of projects. You know, I think that bonds are one way, but ultimately not the only way we can do it. But this is a way for us to get started. I'm really excited about what's going to be happening from the federal government and investing in our communities and infrastructure across the United States. And I think there's some really big opportunities there. So I feel like those are the big low-hanging fruit coming up soon. There's a lot of really great projects that are happening from, you know, the Ormond Beach wetlands I talked about, from Bayona to the Bayona wetlands here in LA. To all kinds of places in the Bay Area, and they actually have local funds that are helping to support how they protect their wetlands. And so there's a lot of exciting stuff going on that we could invest in now. But I'm really excited about some of these, you know, one of my pet projects is starting to think, you know, I mentioned that natural gas power plant that's right in the middle of the Ormond Beach wetlands. And, you know, I'm one of the things that I'm passionate about is how do we get funding to get rid of a lot of this sturdy and infrastructure off of our coast or out of our oceans. And so that's a pet project for me. I don't know if I'm going to be able, you know, the city of Oxnard is thinking about really sort of innovative ways to get the oil companies to put aside funding. There's actually nothing in law right now that's going to force them to take that infrastructure off of the beach. It may just sit there and rust. So how do we, so the city's really thinking through how do you get the oil company to put money aside to do that. And so that's going to be one way, but that's not going to be enough money. And these are questions that we have in lots of other communities. You know, there's ones down in Los Angeles and other places. And so thinking through how do we get, as we transition to a renewable system, how do we get some of that old infrastructure out of there? So ask me in like 5 to 10 years if I've been successful.
That's fantastic. This is also exciting. Just like we had one more question. I realized that Norm Thomas left something in the Q&A. If Alyssa, if you can take like a minute and read the question in the Q&A and type an answer to it, because we have to shut this down so we can move into worship. If you can click on that and then click on type answer and answer Norm's question. But we're just going to have you back because there's just this is way too interesting. So Alyssa Mann, thank you so much for being here with us. We're going to continue to look at ways that we can support the efforts of the Nature Conservancy and conservation. Just thank you for all you're doing. It is literally about saving the planet and saving us all. So thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.